David, people were shocked by the news of the Notre Dame Cathedral burning so rapidly, and I think also shocked by the almost equally rapid conclusion that it was definitely not arson. Hello, David. Thank you for joining me again today. How are you?
Well, thank you, Jason. It's good to be with you. And of course, that's the MO that this extraordinary technology that we've identified basically through the patent office, which talks about multiple tunneling of data from crime scenes, let's say, where it would appear that any reference to a crime that might indicate the criminal's mind and what they're going to do is scrubbed from websites that might actually expose the truth. So I think we're onto something. Over to you.
Well, we've been certainly exposed to people who are busily scrubbing, and it's quite interesting because, often the things that you come up with are so complex, it's difficult for the average person to comprehend, let alone believe. However, when there's such tremendous effort put in on the part of certain individuals who seem to love to watch and criticize our program, one can only conclude that they must have some motivation to dissuade people from looking at what we're showing them or listening to what we're saying. Do you want to talk about some of the things that we've illustrated in today's photo collage?
Yes, and congratulations on the collage. It's an amazing achievement, I think. So across the top along the bridge, over on the left, you have the Grenfell Tower in London, which was clad with a very interesting material. I think it was a trilaminar composition of aluminum with what looks like a polyethylene type of insulation between. And my research from years back now indicates that if you were able to get a spark across the aluminium plates, that material between the plates may be rocket fuel, right? And that's a very good way of demolishing a building. But anyway, that was a disaster. I forget how many people had died, but it was really disastrous. And
that was June of 2017 or July, I believe, of 2017, wasn't it? I was there in London when that happened, driving from the airport on the highway, looking at it.
Well, with these very elaborate techniques that SERCO and its shareholders have developed, and SERCO, as you know, we focus on very much because if you move over to the right, you've got a tower which is the World Trade Center Tower number 1. And we go past, of course, the Notre Dame spire coming down. But if we look at World Trade Center Building 1, this is absolutely critical, particularly in terms of when information is released saying that it's not arson, for example. Now, I don't think you need to be... Mr. Sweigert is the man who sneers at your scientific knowledge, which seems perfectly satisfactory to me. I think in a video he was talking about maybe no more than second grade scientific knowledge and claiming that you're scientifically illiterate. And then he waxes forth about this Port of Charleston dirty bomb, and he says, it's really bizarre. He says something about, does Jason know that dirty bombs are no more dangerous than dropping a light bulb in a Walmart car park? Well, I just imagine Sweigert wandering around with light bulbs, testing, the vulnerability of Walmart being shut down with light bulbs dropping. I mean,
you're inspiring a future collage, David. Perhaps Mr. Sweigert should be installing light bulbs.
Oh, and then he goes on, and he treads on dangerous territory. He said, it could be just cesium-137, maybe from the remnants of some dentist's office. Not that I know whether cesium-137 is used in the dentist. And it could be a firecracker, and, it wouldn't be very dangerous. No more dangerous than a light bulb dropping in the car park. And then I wrote a riposte, if you will, in one of my posts, because I happen to be familiar with the handling of cesium-137. And it's very dangerous, but obviously it's the level of activity. And I pointed out if you had a highly active source with the kind of thermite incendiary devices that brought the towers down, you could have spread contamination all around the Port of Charleston and shut it down. Then he took that video down. At least I think he did. But anyway,
Well,
back to the
yeah.
bridge.
Just on that briefly, David, I do want to remind people that they can go to your Patreon page at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and see all of the posts. These are essentially blog posts David is writing every day. In addition to the videos that we do together, people can become sponsors of David on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and view those posts. The blog posts are, of course, free to everyone, and on Fridays at 2 p.m. David and I are doing a subscriber-only show that is available to people who sponsor David or Crowdsource the Truth by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and then as well they can go to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. And David, with regard to this video, the cesium-137, Sweigert's right. I don't know anything about cesium-137, but I don't need to. There have been multiple government reports that claim that dirty bombs are dangerous, and the thing that's most interesting about it is his instant removal of that video. He's constantly scrubbing the internet of information that could otherwise lead to evidence regarding things he's said and done. I find that interesting.
Well, I think from a cinematographic point of view, if that's a word, I think the guy is disastrous, because you have this pudgy little finger being waved over some table, right? And then this prepper kitty, well, comes running across, and this guy in the background, David Squawkins, you know. I mean, the guy, anyway, we don't want to devote too much time, but it is important, right? When the MO of the conspiracy is manifested in an early announcement that cannot be true if the people have actually conducted research. So let's take General Alexander Haig being interviewed at 9 o'clock on the morning of 9/11. I think it was Fox News, not sure on that. And the camera is pointing at the north face of the North Tower, and there's a nice, convincing Hollywood-style gash that I guess you could argue looks like a plane has gone into the building. No debris on the outside, as far as we can tell. And the interviewer is saying to General Haig, General Haig, who do you think is behind this? Now, this is 10 minutes or 14 minutes after impact at 8:46:46, and 2 minutes before the second plane hits the south face of the South Tower. So General Alexander Haig, I'm in charge here, says, oh, well, I don't want to speculate. And the clown, basically, that means he's about to speculate because he's reading a script. He says, we know where to look. It's the Palestinians or Bin Laden groups. Well, how's that for forensic research? Maybe he's got a class for forensic economics and he can teach me a thing or two. How would he possibly know that it was the Bin Laden group unless it had been scripted from the exercise of June the 1st and 2nd of 2001? So going back to the collage, if you look at the north face of the North Tower, I think it's the north face of the North Tower, you can see something very interesting. And you remember some time ago, I challenged Mr. Sweigert, who's apparently an Air Force veteran, to see if he could come up with a Boeing aircraft that would be able to punch a tunnel through 8 walls of the Pentagon into the inner courtyard with 1.5 tons debris inside. He hasn't responded. Now, whether that's because he's got a scientific education to grade 3, I don't know. But I defy him actually to find a Boeing thin-skinned aluminum hull aircraft that could punch a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon. If we look at the north face of the North Tower, or the North Tower, what do we see? Just at the root of the antenna, you can see some squibs. Basically, that is highly energetic powder being thrown out in a ballistic profile, which actually, when it's translated, you have 10-ton girders being thrown out ballistically or in a parabolic arc, embedding themselves into buildings 100 meters away. Maybe Mr. Sweigert can give us a lecture on gravity, but if he's at a loss for words, maybe I can fill in for him. Gravity, Mr. Sweigert, acts downwards. It does not eject particles or 10-ton girders with a velocity probably of 100 miles an hour to embed themselves in buildings 100 meters away. This building was blown up. And of course, building 2 was blown up. And building number 7 was blown up. And there are hot spots down on the ground where you can see that they used ultra high temperature accelerants, probably a thermite-based incendiary. And what this does, of course, it creates an enormous gas inside the elevator shaft and literally blows the building up, so you get this horizontal projection. So this was a classic example where the conspirators, which I believe we now can relate to the evil teachers based out of Chicago, the conspirators had a script. They intended to blow this building up, and they had a script to get the people looking in the wrong direction, i.e. the bin Laden group, this guy straddling a cave in Afghanistan. So who might have the kind of appetite and knowledge for blowing up a building like the World Trade Center? Well, there we are. In that tunnel on the left, you've got the maitre d', which is, I guess, Barack Hussein Obama. You've got the woman waving her arms. I don't know whether that's in surrender, but we'll come back to that. But she is an intellectual property lawyer. Now, at the back there, of course, you have Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. And they wanted to blow the United States up in the 1970s. And to a certain extent they did, but they used rather piddly little bombs and not much modern technology. But they certainly had the appetite to do it. And that group, and this is really interesting from the evil Batcave point of view, Mr. Bill Ayers has been decades on faculty at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which hosts the evil Batcave, electronic visualization.
Now, excuse me for a moment, David. Could you just lower your microphone down towards your mouth just a touch? I think it would give us improved audio. And to remind people, that's much better. To remind people who are watching, the evil Batcave, of course, is the electronic visualization, bright, advanced technology, cave automatic visualization environment at the University of Illinois in Chicago, right?
Yes, and the electronic visualization lab kicked off, I think, in 1991, but its roots were in some kind of visualization technology at the University of Illinois in Chicago that go back to the 1970s. So it's pretty mature technology, but every year they come up with more powerful methods of visualization and projection. And actually, I consider you to be a master of that with your wonderful Phantasma VR, and we could come to that a little later. Now, his wife, that is Bill Ayers' wife, there's the spiel on it, is Bernardine Dawn, and she spent decades at Northwestern University lecturing on children and law. I shudder to be a child around this woman, but anyway. One of her seminars is Torture, Paradigms and Practice. And these two grifters, or psychopaths, as I understand it, they groomed Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson for the career that ultimately took them to the White House. Now, how big is this network, or how powerful is this network linked to the Electronic Visualization Laboratory? In 2002, I think the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Northwestern University introduced what they call EduRoam, EduRoam. And as I understand it, any member university of EduRoam can provide a card to faculty or students, and they can go anywhere in the world, right? For example, University of Canterbury in Christchurch, near the mosque where the shooter performed his work, and they can plug in, and effectively it acts like a global hotspot. Now, you're younger than I am. Does that make sense to you, Jason?
It does. I'm not directly familiar with EduRoam, so I'm sure there are technical aspects of it that someone will make a video about telling us that we don't know what we're talking about. But I think on the surface, what you're talking about makes sense. It's some sort of private network. Just from looking at the website here, it says, use your school's Wi-Fi authentication at any EduRoam hotspot in the world and join instantly and securely. So I think this is indicating that there's some sort of arrangement between various Wi-Fi hotspots around the world that could be owned and operated by any network operator. And of course, once you're on the internet, the very definition of the internet is the interconnection of all the computer networks that are connected to it. So perhaps EduRoam is using some sort of virtual private network so that its users can have secure access to various things wherever they are in the world. We've spoken in the past, David, about my personal experience with VPNs. When I was in China for a film festival, a 3D film festival, I wasn't able to access Facebook, and of course when I went to Mexico I wasn't able to access Pacer, which is I guess a US government website that lets you look at court documents and things like that. So using a virtual private network, I would be able to effectively sort of avoid some of the restrictions of the public internet in China or Mexico or other countries. Maybe EduRoam is doing something like that.
Well, absolutely, and of course on the bridge back on the collage we have that interesting cluster of member organizations, which is the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, up on the billboard over on the right. And of course we have the state of Illinois, the most corrupt state in the union. We have the Department of Justice, and we have Veterans Affairs. Now what that means is if, for example, let me just turn that, sorry. If we have, for example, the technology where there's integration of EduRoam, which let's say is a global hotspot for faculty and students, with the Federal Bridge, it may be possible, given that the BBC is connected to Northwestern University, for the BBC to record what Dr. Thomas Barnett described in respect of people jumping out of the North Tower as the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
And this is so very sobering, because I think the evil teachers, and I just use that because very conveniently EVL stands for, spells out evil. The evil teachers have networks that would allow you actually to produce a live broadcast of a snuff film or a contract hit or a torture episode up at the pig farm in British Columbia, to be transmitted through Starnet communications through various facilities, which would put it into 4-star or 5-star hotels, where if that turned his crank, Bill Clinton could watch something that most human beings would rather not watch, which is the torture killing of a target. Now, am I accusing Clinton of being involved? Not really. I'm just saying that effectively these teachers, and remember, Obama and his wife are University of Chicago. I believe that she was Vice President of Community Affairs at the University of Chicago Medical Hospitals on $315,000 a year, which is nice work if you can get it. The Bill Ayers is, as I say, University of Illinois, Chicago. Bernadine Dawn, Northwestern University, with her IT partnerships that link up to the Russian Federation and China and the BBC. What I'm suggesting, actually, Jason, is there is an EduRoam real-time high-speed network hooked through to the Federal Bridge and Northwestern IT partnerships, which is actually superior and faster and infinitely more dangerous to the survival of the United States of America than the military networks such as Spar War. I believe America has a problem. Over to you.
Well, it's interesting, David. I mean, again, these connections that you've made, we're speculating about the possibility that these things could happen, and you've certainly pointed out technologies that would enable them. When we look at that juxtaposed next to the fact pattern whereby one of the most notorious groups of domestic terrorists are also linked to these very things, it becomes an interesting avenue to explore. And I'm still waiting for a call back from Maxine Brown, or perhaps the legal department from the, was it the University of Illinois? She didn't seem too pleased to speak to me when I called her that time, but they haven't called back either. We're not accusing them of anything. We just want to ask questions about this stuff to get some more detail. I find it highly problematic that they would hire Bill Ayers or Bernadine Dorn. Obviously, you know, there's issues with the broken chains of custody and spoliation of evidence and improperly gathered evidence that have prevented Bernardine Dohrn or Bill Ayers from ever serving any prison time for the murders and domestic terrorism that they were involved in the 1960s, that we can understand. There's certainly flaws with the way the justice system works, but why a university would then hire these people rather than shunning them as outcasts and deviants and really evil people, that's a question I'd like to ask their legal department. So I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for the call back.
And I think I have the answer. It's fear. So if you go back to the collage and let's look at some of the terrifying things that these people seem to get up to. Now, going along the top, we've got this Emmanuel Macron, an alumni of N.M. Rothschild and Sons, or the Rothschild equivalent in Paris. And he's gesturing, of course, as the spire of the Notre Dame Cathedral comes down. I mean, he's not gesturing because it's a collage. And the spire is coming down, highly symbolic, I think. I just imagine, apparently ISIS was very quick to gloat at the destruction of the tower or the spire. And that, again, begs the question, since ISIS has not been crushed, in spite of what Mr. Trump would like to think, or President Trump would like to say, why wouldn't ISIS have got some fancy weapons and ignited an ultra high temperature accelerant inside the tower? And let me just go down the collage down to the left, and I'll talk a bit about Maxar Technologies. Over the tunnel on the left, above Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, you can see the logo of Maxar Technologies. And if we just hold it there, this is really a very interesting company. This Maxar grew out of several companies, including Digital Globe, but the one that really intrigues me, right back to when I arrived in BC in 1992, was a company called McDonald Detweiler and Associates Limited, founded by John McDonald, whom I met in 1995. I wanted to explore whether or not we could buy the company for my artificial intelligence work and a defense contractor back in the UK. He didn't look me in the eye, but I won't go there because that's something of a diversion. But Maxar Technologies, or McDonald Detweiler, had developed a mobile radio data management system in the 1970s, used by the Vancouver Police and the RCMP with their squad cars to do criminal background checks if someone was stopped in a roadblock, etc., etc. They sold that technology, I think, in 1988 to, I think it was Motorola, through Mobile Data International. So Motorola, and remember, I'm coming back to 911, those firefighters were equipped with Motorola handsets that appear to have been modified. So they didn't get the order to evacuate the building. So when tower number 2 came down, because tower number 2 came down before tower number 1, there should have been, I guess, an all stations alert, and every firefighter in tower number 1 should have got out, but they didn't, because those Motorola radios were jammed. That's my allegation. Motorola Solutions headquarters are now in Chicago. And it seems to me that there was a movement to gather all of the essential networks that would be required to overthrow the government of the United States on 911 in Chicago, including this bizarre decision to move Boeing headquarters from Washington State to Chicago. So it was commissioned just a few days before the 911 attack. So if I'd been chairman of Boeing, I would never allow my directors or my head office to get any significant distance between the head office and the main production facility, because I would want to know, or I want my directors to know, what the hell's going on in that plant.
Right.
Had the Boeing headquarters been in the vicinity of that plant, I think they would have found saboteurs had been introduced into the Boeing workforce through the Small Business Administration Mentor Protege program, which takes protege companies owned by someone who is deemed to be disadvantaged by virtue of ethnicity, race, faith, and sexual orientation, and all those other good things. And the company, the mentor company, is obliged, if it's going to get a government contract, to take on board a certain 10% of the income has to go through to these disadvantaged companies, which at first blush, I would say, don't necessarily have a conspicuous loyalty to the United States and its survival or its success. And the woman behind that, I believe, is Christine Marcy, right? The sister of Field McConnell, who's a Marine Corps vet. And this is a very, very dangerous woman. And I've been pointing out how dangerous it was since I think December of 2006, when Field McConnell told me that he had a sister who was a bureaucrat in Washington. Now, I
David,
don't know if you want to
pause you there for a second, because I think this is, again, pretty important. You've been speaking about Christine Marcy for some time. I never heard of her before I met you in Field. Field is her brother. He's told us various things about her. I take those things to be true until we hear otherwise. You raised to my attention this very interesting and unusual article written about Ms. Marcy in 1979 in the Washington Post. I think a lot of people might have heard my phone call with the Washington Post just the other day or last week, whenever that was, because we had noticed very strangely that, you know, the article was altered in March of 2019. This is an article where, you know, in the 1970s, obviously it was far less common for women to hold important positions in the government than it is today. So this was an article about Christine Marcy and the breakthroughs that she was making for women as a supergrade in the government. We had identified early on that there were some strange typos in it. This used to say Christine Mary, now a supergrade, had her first chili 2.5 years ago. And of course, it makes sense that that was intended to say Christine Marcy and her first child and everything. But the strangest aspect of this article was its reference to Mendenhall's baby. Now, we don't know what happened to change it to Marcy's baby, but someone has obviously proactively contacted the Washington Post to change that, and somebody else has gone as far as contacting the Washington Post and suggesting that you and I have manipulated this article. I certainly have no power over the Washington Post, and I was surprised to see this changed. I did retrieve the original microfilm, which is a photographic plate of the 1979 newspaper, exactly as it appeared in August 8th of 1979, and that seems to present contradictory evidence with regard to what is written in this article versus what's been said about you and I and what's presented there in the Washington Post online today. People who want to know more about this should definitely get on to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource-the-truth. You can see that in our episode from last Friday where we asked the question, did SERCO agents scrub evil teachers' tunnels to break Secret Service Mendenhall chains? They seem very focused on scrubbing the internet of this Mendenhall term, which, David, you've told me describes a ritualistic type of rape that we have speculated could in fact be some sort of indoctrination ritual for a secret society, one of these sort of like Greek society type things where everyone is bound to secrecy and has some secret over everyone in the group that creates this sort of lifetime sense of loyalty. So again, the thing that fascinates me so much about the different things that you're sharing with our audience and telling me about is just how the story becomes more and more cohesive as we go along. It's one of these things that's so complex and so involved and deals with so many bizarre, different, disparate seeming pieces that when you first hear it, it sounds totally ridiculous, maybe even untrue to some people. But the more we are delving into these facts and details and searching for the evidence, the stronger your arguments become.
And the more energetically they try to scrub.
Yes.
You see, and let's just go zoom in on that right-hand tunnel, and we'll just talk a little bit about the other characters and why this Mendenhall world is so important. So Mendenhalling, according to the Urban Dictionary, describes mounting someone from behind and then rolling them over to see the humiliation in their eyes, preferably in front of a large audience. And that would be consistent with what I understand goes on with some of these Greek life societies, where the students are, what do they call it? They go through an oath-taking ritual that is so humiliating and embarrassing. I don't say they'd necessarily rather die, but they do not want the images of those rituals ever to be published and shared with mummy and daddy or their friends, because the shame would be just too great. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a program driven by, let's say, British intelligence to entrap people in these kind of encounters, ritualistic or otherwise, involving children or otherwise, where the imagery is sufficient, maybe, potentially, to put someone on death row? So wouldn't it be interesting to know if Christine Marcy was mendenhalled in 1978 and her baby was born in August of 1979? And that's the beauty of this show. And I hope the audience enjoyed this, because what I'd like to say, this is an open invitation to anyone in the audience to join us on what is a voyage of discovery, CSI discovery, because as you and I talk, we discover on the fly. But let me back up. So who was in Washington in 1978 who might have been the Mendenhaller or to Christine Marcy's Mendenhallee? Well, lo and behold, it turns out that Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, was in Washington, D.C. in 1978 as the personal assistant to Senator Mark Hatfield, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which I understand to be the most powerful committee in the United States Senate, because it has the pork barreling and earmark authority, where you can send $1 billion into a Boeing tanker project, even if subsequently Darlene Druin spent some time in jail because she basically arranged for her daughter to get a nice job with Boeing. I mean, incredibly potentially corrupt, but there it is. Yeah. So Nicholas Soames has a brother.
Yes.
And his brother is Rupert Soames. And Rupert Soames is the chief executive officer of SERCO. And SERCO had a shareholders meeting on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11, where the then chief executive officer, Chris Hyman, was actually at the Windows of the World breakfast meeting for the Risk Waters Group up at the top of the North Tower. Around 8:30, for whatever reason, maybe he'd had a nice breakfast, I don't think it's as simple as that, he got up and he went down in the elevator to the 47th floor, which would be slightly above slightly below the flame base, I think, of the collage. I don't know, I would think that's probably about the 89th floor, I would say. I'm just guessing in the terms of the distance to the antenna. So on the 47th floor, Christopher Hyman addresses or presents, let's say, an opportunity to SERCO shareholders or the representatives of SERCO shareholders, perhaps to make a great deal of money. Well, what kind of financial instrument might be attractive to SERCO shareholders, at least the insiders, that might make a great deal of money out of the attack of 9/11? Well, maybe a catastrophe bond that would pay to the sponsors if both towers came down on the same day through fire. Of course, that would imply that people talking about 911 should be prepped. Is it Sweigert have a prepper kitty?
Yeah.
What is the significance of a prepper kitty?
I think that preppers are people who are, storing food and guns and dealing in survival techniques for the day when, the SHTF, sort of like survival tactics. And I guess they also hate our show or don't want people to know anything that we're talking about. David, we're getting a lot of comments here in the chat from people who want sort of a recap. It's a little difficult for us to do a recap, but certainly with regard to the Mendenhall aspect of the story, people can still see my phone call with the Washington Post on the Crowdsource the Truth YouTube channel, or of course on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. And David, there are open threats that this Mendenhall issue will be litigated in open court. I'm certainly eager to see if the litigious plaintiffs will cite case law related to Cleveland Steamers and Dirty Sanchez or various things like that to support their claims related to Mendenhalling, but that remains to be seen for sure.
Well, I'm sure they'll want to call Christine Marcy as a witness, and possibly the Mendenhall. Or didn't one of these people write to Nicholas Soames and say that we'd accused him of being a Mendenhall?
That's the guy who's called the Washington Post and basically falsely accused you and I of engaging in criminal activity.
Mm. Well, I guess he's taken some time off from trying to prove that I didn't go to Cambridge, right? And I didn't get a scholarship, that I got kicked out in my second year. I mean, the guy is, I think he's off his meds, but anyway, it's a distraction. Let's come back to this collage again, and I understand how people might want to recap. And I suppose the short answer is they just have to keep listening to our show, because we tread as carefully as we can through a complex path. But the bottom line is, I think in those three tunnels, you essentially see a conspiracy that goes back at least to Lord Rothschild in 1976, when he published the Royal Commission on Gaming or Gambling. Lord Rothschild, or Victor Rothschild, he died in 1990. He was the main man for the Tizard mission, transferring the technologies like the cavity magnetron, the proximity fuse, radar systems, friend or foe identification to the Americans to ramp up production in 1940, because the British facilities were getting bombed out of their minds. And of course, from then on, the British and the American, I would say, patent offices were linked at the hip. Basically, they did deals with each other that if someone invented it, the other party could produce it, or vice versa. And if there was a profit to be made, they'd share in the profit. But going back to 1940, so Victor Rothschild became the principal advisor, I think, to Churchill's toy shop.
Right.
Now, Rothschild was a biologist and a chemist of some repute, and he was very interested in germ warfare. Now, one form of germ warfare, or biological toxins recently released, was that Novichok in Salisbury.
Right.
I mustn't go off too much at that tangent. All I'm saying is, here we've got a very interesting connection with the three tunnels that might very well support a death pool conspiracy. That is to say, where people presented with the right kind of data from a crime scene, let's say the time-stamped and location stamp of the data from a crime scene, could engage in death pooling, where they bet on the body counts or the time of death of a target. Now, body counts, for example, I think they would have had the technology to bet on the body counts for the firefighters in each of those buildings as separate events, simply because through the Motorola radios, they would have known where each firefighter was, I guess. They would have known that by jamming the communications to the firefighters so they didn't get the signal to evacuate, they would all die if the towers could be brought down. And it's, I think, a crying shame, and I use those words very consciously, that 343 firefighters died on 9/11, and most Americans have moved on. And that's a fatal mistake, if I may say so. Because if they could do it to 343 firefighters on 9/11, they could do it, let's say, was Larry Growold. He predicted, or he said, or was told by Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers that they would need to kill 25 million Americans if they couldn't be re-educated for their new socialist regime. So we have a tragedy in the making, and it's still in the making, because America has not dismantled the conspiracy that put together the 9/11 attack. So back to the collage, we have Hillary Clinton playing her role as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, I think she fulfills many of the characteristics of that. I'm not talking about her hunch, but
You've
that's
got a
by the
hunch.
by. I just have a hunch, right? And then you have this clown, Wilbur Ross. Now, why would I call him a clown, Jason?
Well, I don't know, any number of reasons. He wanted to talk about space rather than SERCO when I spoke with him.
Well, what about his patent, his knowledge about how the patent office operates?
Oh, right. He said, the patent office runs itself, which I found weird. I don't think it runs itself.
Well, it certainly doesn't with SERCO as the outsourcer that has processed on November the 17th of last year 4 million patents out of the total 10 million patents that the United States Patent and Trademark Office has processed. That means SERCO is the de facto custodian of patents that were allegedly used to cause the wrongful deaths of nearly 3,000 people in the United States on the morning of 9/11. Now, this is very important because from a point of view of liability and an attempt, if one wanted to prove criminal liability, you don't need to prove criminal liability if we can prove, or the injured communities of relatives of the dead can prove, that the patents were used negligently, recklessly, willfully, or fraudulently to cause the wrongful death of 343 firefighters. And the interesting thing about SERCO being the custodian of the patent office, that would make its shareholders, in my opinion, liable for damages that would really make their eyes water. Because can you imagine if we can demonstrate, and I'm sure we can using our virtual production crew, we could demonstrate to the families of the firefighters who died on 9/11 that there's a very simple remedy for this, and that's why we have this word discovery, at least in my name, is if you take a case like this into the civil courts and claim for wrongful death associated with the custodians of the patents, it's a balance of probability argument. We don't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Wilbur Ross was on the floor number 47 in the North Tower. All we can say is, well, he's worked 25 years with N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, and N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited is the investment banker for Donald Trump, Queen Elizabeth II, and SERCO.
David, what is Mr. Soames' connection to N.M. Rothschild?
Which Soames are we talking about, Rupert or
Either. The guy here.
Oh, okay. Well, now the interesting thing about Victor Rothschild presented the Royal Commission on Gaming or Gambling in 1976, and he was a gambler himself. So he would have had all of the background knowledge necessary to refine or develop dead pool gambling. And now, obviously, the Royal Commission was not thinking about gambling, dead pool gambling at the moment, but I'll tell you a guy who was. You've got it. You've got Howard Lutnick there, and the title of that patent is Real-Time Interactive Wagering on Event Outcomes. Now, isn't that an interesting title? Because if we take the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history, as described with the people jumping out of the North Tower by Dr. Thomas Barnett, wouldn't it be interesting if they combined the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history on the BBC with a real-time interactive wagering on the body count? Now, that would be interesting to know what Mr. Howard Lutnick was doing on 9/11. Well, he was the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald, and he was taking his son to school when 685 of his colleagues were obliterated at the top of the North Tower, including his brother.
Yeah.
Now, I think there you've got the basis for a very simple argument in a civil court for damages for wrongful death, where we take the interactive wagering on event outcomes, let's say hypothetically it's body counts or the time of death, the Howard Lemelson prisoner tracking, where you use artificial...
Lemelson.
Sorry, yes, Jerome Lemelson, sorry about that. Jerome Lemelson, where the patent describes the use of artificial intelligence expert system and fuzzy logic algorithms to reward or punish prisoners who are either doing or not doing what they're told, including dwelling in a certain area for a certain time, such as, let's say, the people who went into the Twin Towers and building number 7, in my belief, and laid down the thermite-based incendiaries in the elevator shafts. So when it came necessary to drop those buildings and destroy all the evidence, a remote, probably fiber optic link to the igniters set it off, and you got the boom, 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 top-down demolition of Towers 1 and 2, and the bottom-up demolition of Tower number 7, which destroyed a great deal of evidence, but not all the evidence, because when you destroy or spoliate evidence, Mr. Sweigert, that's an indication which allows us an aggressive inference of guilt. Over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, David, I would add that for people who think that what you're describing sounds perhaps fantastic or not entirely believable, you're referencing evidence and quotes and things that others have said. This snuff film idea is not yours. This came from Dr. Thomas Barnett, who is an American military strategist and a professor, I believe, at the Naval War College. He's the one who described this mass snuff film. He called the events of the destruction of the World Trade Center the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history, and we're just, taking his word for it. He, irrespective of my public school education and what I know or don't know about science or snuff films or computer networks, I think Thomas Barnett knows a lot. At least the War College, the U.S. Naval War College, endorses him. So why not accept what he says as true?
And I know a lot about cesium-137 because I've handled the stuff in the oil industry. I know a lot about explosives because I handle explosives, right? And when Mr. Sweigert says, well, it's like a firecracker and a little bit of residuals from a dentist practice, and it's no more dangerous than dropping a light bulb in the Walmart car park, I can tell him that if you use a high activity source from the oil industry and combine that with thermite incendiary, you could spread contaminants over a vast area and shut down the port of Charleston. So I'm very interested in the cast. Now, what did I was thinking about cast for Mr. Sweigert, like Con Air spoliation team or something like that. And what I think Mr. Sweigert appears to have done, he's assembled a cast of people whose sole purpose in life is to scrub truth seekers from the internet. Right? I see no purpose. Like, for example, does Sweigert have any explanation for the way those planes were flown on 911? Does the tattooed Hulk in Poland, does he have any explanation for why he can't find a reference to me getting a scholarship from Queen's College, Cambridge? I mean, why don't these people get a regular job and go out and do something productive? I mean, what you and I are doing with our listeners, I think, we're on a voyage of discovery like no other. I mean, no one has journeyed along this path, a fact-based path, which if we are successful, and by success, it's not my success or your success, it's a remedy, I think, for the families of the people who died on 911 and in related events, like out of the pig farm. Maybe we could just quickly look at the central tunnel.
Sure.
Jason?
Absolutely.
If we zoom in on there. So here are the victims of this conspiracy, which I think is a Deadpool conspiracy that is engaged in patent for rent and murder for hire, where insiders are betting on body counts and times of death. And they have vast resources, somewhat like I think JFK was describing, guerrillas by night and not armies by day, infiltration instead of invasion, to take out whistleblowers and people who might expose the core conspiracy, which I believe relates to the use of pedophile entrapment and extortion and blackmail to keep an entire network of otherwise decent people silent. So what characters do we have in this central tunnel? Over on the left, we have Julian Assange, who in 1991 hacked into the Nortel server in Melbourne. And it was Nortel that spun off Entrust, that was implemented by Maxar Technologies around the world on networks attached to the evil Batcave in Chicago, in my belief. Now, in 1993, Mr. Assange helped the Victoria police roll up a pedophile network. Now, what does that make him? Well, he's a young man. He's an expert hacker, as is Mr. Sweigert. And he's apparently very interested in exposing pedophile networks. At least he helped the Victoria police. Let me talk about Mr. Sweigert's letter to Maxine Brown, dated February the 20th, 2019. And if Mr. Sweigert needs a job description, I guess many people might want to take his email address, which is spoliation-notice@mailbox.org. So I presume Mr. Sweigert is in the spoliation business. Is that a reasonable assessment?
He is, for sure.
Okay. The subject is the misuse of NSF-acquired technologies to facilitate the high-speed transfer of snuff films via the UIC Electronic Visualization Laboratory. And it went to a number of people, including Maxine Brown. His first paragraph is, as you are aware, a Cambridge-educated forensic economist, I guess that's me, thank you, Mr. Sweigert, has published evidence concerning the use of the UIC EVL to distribute child murder films, videos, to the senior staff of various federal agencies. Well, I didn't say that, but Mr. Sweigert did. Maybe Mr. Sweigert can tell us if he got any reply. I mean, he's alerted now the people at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Anyway, moving on. We have a woman by the name of Liz McCain, who died shortly afterwards, exposing the pedophile rings in the BBC, implemented or initiated, I guess, by Jimmy Savile, run for perhaps over 30 or 40 years.
Ooh, I forgot to include him in the collage.
No, he's not a victim, right? Well, anyway, that's kind of by the by. Then we have Jill Dando, who was going to her home. She had a boyfriend, so she wasn't back at her regular home very often. I forget the year this happened. She was opening or put the key in the door. Someone came up behind her and shot her in the back of the head with a specially modified bullet that apparently didn't make too much noise, but killed the poor woman. And she was the presenter for Crime Watch, and she was trying to alert the senior people in the BBC to this pedophile ring that appears to have attracted very senior people in the British government, and I believe exists to this day. Down on the left, you've got this red North Face sports bag, occupied, unfortunately, by the body of a man called Gareth Williams, who was a brilliant Cambridge-educated mathematician who joined GCHQ, and he was a very good hacker as well. Now, whether he's a better hacker than Sweigert, I don't know, but maybe he hacked Sweigert, found things out that he shouldn't have done. But he also hacked the Clinton diary, and apparently discovered, I assume, the number of trips that Clinton and apparently his wife, Hillary Clinton, were making to the island owned by Jeffrey Epstein on the Lolita Express. Apparently that was the plane, private plane, where the Clintons could be serviced by underage children.
There's a new lawsuit pending in that matter. Someone's brought some charges against Alan Dershowitz, having filed, I think just yesterday, a new accuser related to the whole Jeffrey Epstein scandal.
Wow. Anyway, then we have little JonBenet Ramsey. I remind Americans, I don't like saying it, but how this little girl died. She appears to have been tasered, once under the ear, once in the belly. She was garroted, her skull was fractured, and she'd been sodomized. There's no way of presenting that other than disgusting. But there was a 3-page ransom note. Now, this 3-page ransom note, the media, may it rot in hell, alleges or asserts that the most likely suspect, or a possible suspect, was her 10-year-old brother. I mean, that is sordid beyond belief.
It's absurd.
Right? Right? The letter was signed Victory, SBTC. And I say to myself, well, what kind of victory is it when you torture a little girl to death on Christmas Day of 1996. But it's a 3-page ransom note, and it talks of $118,000. So if you zoom out and over to the right to look at the bridge, Jason, we'll see that the company that appears to have paid John Benet Ramsey's father $118,000 by way of a bonus was Lockheed Martin. And at the time, Lockheed Martin had 2 directors of note for 911, Lynn Cheney and Norman Mineta. Now, I imagine that the images of that poor little girl being tortured to death were ferried or transported or communicated to directors of Lockheed Martin as a warning to what was required of them. And
David, let me interrupt for just a second, because it's also noteworthy to mention that the same people that are busily calling the Washington Post and alerting them falsely, basically accusing you and I believe the complaint said that the article has been tampered with by 2 individuals. He's blatantly accused you and I of tampering with some sort of public record. I don't know how he even proposes that we would do that, but it's claims like this that he makes that are so ridiculous, so unfounded, so, no basis in fact, no evidence whatsoever, that cause me to discount essentially everything that he says. The same person who's made that accusation has accused us of violating copyright law by referring to this infographic, which was created by Certipath. And of course, you and I are commenting on it in the context of elements of public interest, news stories related to Lockheed Martin directors, the Boeing company, etc. And this type of usage of this infographic image and reference to it would quite clearly be covered by the fair use doctrine of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And it's also worth mentioning that there are no hard and fast rules to that. I should say it's a set of rules, but any decision related to that doctrine are made on a case-by-case basis. That's written into it. So, we would have to be using this in some way that would be objectionable to the owner of it, to the extent that they would initiate some sort of legal action and then prove that what we were doing was in violation of fair use. But beyond that, I've been given express permission to use that in the way that we're using it. So it's strange that these people keep trying to stop us from talking about this, from sharing information with our sponsors on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. They just don't want this information getting out, David. They don't want people to go to your Patreon page and view your daily posts or watch the videos that you and I are doing together that are available on all of those outlets. That activity in and of itself just draws attention to what they're doing, to the extent that I think we have a justified purpose in questioning their motives and examining them, the network that they're in, the things that they're doing. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I think CAST, I remember now why I was working on that acronym for Sweigert. I think it works very well for people to understand. This would be Con Air scrubbing tunnels.
That's good.
Right. Now, when you think about Con Air, Christine Marcy and Jamie Gorelick and Janet Reno were the 3 witches of that were in charge of the Department of Justice in the early 90s. They probably, by the end of the decade, they'd got 1 million Americans incarcerated. Now, going through a prison system overseen by Christine Marcy, Jamie Gorelick, and Janet Reno would be a pretty intimidating experience, even for most people. But of course, what you have, and I think Christine Marcy allegedly boasts of it, she developed a prisoner medical services program, which I think is a euphemism for administering drugs. And I go back to that Eli Lilly patent of, is it 1956, lysergic acid amide, which is a mind-altering drug, and the blurb says something to the effect, this drug or this formulation is useful from a psychotherapeutic point of view because it elicits characteristic patterns of rage and hallucination. You've got people who have been, I don't know, picked up for some minor infringement, and they've been put in a cell where they're abused on a regular basis by their cellmates. It would be a truly terrifying experience where, if you had access to that prisoner tracking facility, you could offer rewards and punishments to prisoners, I imagine, to get them to do almost anything. You could fly on Conair. Christine Marcy founded the Conair transportation system in the 1984 or 1985 period. I think she bought a Boeing 727 with money stolen from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund. And you can fly your cast, right, your Conair scrubbing tunnel team, into a crime scene before the crime occurs, right, to take care of business, like picking up the evidence.
Or telling everybody that it definitely wasn't arson.
You've got it. You've got it. So this tunnel is really the scrubbers tunnel, right, occupied by Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, brother of Rupert Soames, the CEO of SERCO, Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, who founded, as best I can judge, the database for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Well, there's your product, right? You've got Conair to move the prisoners and the children into a position, let's say, out at the island occupied by Jeffrey Epstein, with the dentist chair in one of the chalet's washrooms. Right? And then you've got the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, which he founded with Eric Holder in 1984, giving her access to billions and billions of dollars from the sell-off of the Lamborghinis and the drugs confiscated by organized crime. This is the most powerful woman, even today, the most dangerous woman in the United States of America. Now, I think you've tried to interview her, but no reply. So therefore, the three tunnels occupy a group of people that I believe is capable of engaging in death pool betting on body counts and mass casualty events and high-value targets. You've got a central tunnel which is devoted to the tracking of victims that need to be silenced so that they don't blow the whistle on this global network of pedophile entrapment. And I will point out that SERCO, through its demon technology, is into face recognition. So periodically, when you see, 300 pedophile rings rolled up by the police in countries like Turkey and Germany and France, etc., it'll be SERCO, probably, that is identifying those pedophiles that are going to be arrested and neutralized. And apparently the fate of a pedophile in a conventional jail is pretty bad. And then you have over on the right the Conair scrubbing tunnel teams. So I think we covered a lot of ground. Anything else you want to focus on, Jason?
Well, we're sort of out of time for today, David, but I do want to invite people who feel they need a recap to review all of the videos that you and I have done together on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. It's really very important that our viewers support the show. We don't have traditional advertising sponsors, but rather I am trying to kind of reshape the business model for delivering information and news and doing the type of research that you and I do, where we're looking to reach thousands of independent small dollar amount sponsors. That way no one is really financially put out, $2 a month, $5 a month, something like that. The cost of one magazine, one newspaper, one cup of coffee. And if it's spread out among hundreds or even thousands of individual sponsors, you and I can carry on with this research and carry on making these high quality programs, and people can continue to enjoy the conversations that we have and the shows that we bring to everyone on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to thank you, David, for joining me again today. We'll be back on Friday. We're going to be joined by Fireman John, who a lot of people who watch Crowdsource the Truth have seen before. He's going to talk to us in some more detail, and of course with his firsthand professional experience, some of the facts and details surrounding this incredibly unfortunate fire at the Cathedral in Notre Dame, in Paris, the Cathedral of Notre Dame there. And that'll be an interesting show. And then, of course, Fridays at 2 o'clock is when you and I have our subscriber exclusive show. So that'll be really great for everyone. Thanks again, David. It's great to speak with you as always. And I want to thank everybody for watching. I'll see everyone tomorrow.
Thank you, Jason. Bye for now.